an original.
From Story Studio Network.
Well, welcome in. Here we go. It is the 5th day of June 2023, the first Monday of the month. Last month of the school year, all kinds of stuff. Heading into what sounds like in this part of the world is going to be a hot, dry summer. And before you wave the flag and say yay, there are more than, at last count, 200 wildfires across the country, in almost every province now. And of course, we've been focusing on what's been going on in Nova Scotia. The heavy rains that they've had there through the Halifax region has certainly helped. So that one is 100% contained. All of those fires, not the one fire, but and it's so early in the season. So we're in for a bit of a trial. And it's not just happening out in the bush, in the middle of nowhere. We know it's happening in residential areas, certainly in Alberta, British Columbia, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick. I heard this morning that there was a fire detected near Ottawa. Don't know how near, but we're starting to relate them to urban municipality centers. And of course, it's nothing new in places like California, where the wildfires have just devastated parts of it. I saw on the weekend the larger insurance companies now are refusing to offer home insurance to some of the folks who are building homes in California, particularly in these areas where heavy drought and wildfires become the risk of the day. So that puts a whole damper on your beautiful summer as we head into it. But it's one of those harsh realities that we're all going to kind of have to live with, and away we go. All right, there are things to talk about, and we kind of want to catch up on a few things. And watched with interest last week on the show, we were talking to Preet Banerjee. He is a financial analyst out of the UK, and the whole, specter of the American government defaulting on its loans. And for the most part, the cable networks are treating it as a domestic story. But when you step back, Preet's looking at this and saying, wow, if that were to happen, here would be the implications and the ramifications on a global scale. And it was not going to be pretty. Long story short, the president and Congress comes to terms. They have made a deal. It was signed avoiding the default. They have suspended the debt ceiling as of Friday. Sounds like everything's good, but I think there are a couple of things at play. There still is the international implications of the extraordinary debt that the Americans are racking up. I mean, per capita, we are almost as bad here in Canada, but the unfettered spending of government against the backdrop of what happened in COVID, all the implications of that are one thing. And what is the real utility of the debt ceiling? Is that something that's just this arbitrary cudgel that's able to be used as a political, beat down every 3 or 4 years by whoever wants their way with the budget? So we thought we'd get David Schultz in here from Hamline University, political science professor and a constitutional law expert, who you were off in Europe for, a month almost?
I was off in Europe for a month. I was teaching in Riga, Latvia. And as we were mentioning before we went on, I was at the center of, at least some people might say, the center of world hockey for at least a month, and had the opportunity to see Canada win the World Championship.
Yep, and it was quite exciting, sort of on off the side of our desks. We keep an eye on that, and of course, in the middle of all that, the NHL Stanley Cup final is underway now, and neither your Rangers nor my Leafs made much of a dent in that journey again this year, despite the fact that, the Rangers, boy, they muscled up at the trade deadline, as did the Leafs. The Leafs are in far more turmoil now with a new general manager. But needless to say, David, that distracted us here in Toronto really from paying a full undivided attention to what was going on in Latvia. But, again, the idea that the Latvians won a medal at the World Championships, they take their hockey pretty seriously.
They do, and the country's not quite 2 million people, and on the day they had won, actually the day afterwards, is my last day in Riga, they had about 250,000 people in downtown Independence Square. Basically, over 10% of the population showed up for a celebration. It was bedlam. I doesn't even begin to describe. And the patriotism, the flags waving, people were just so happy, just so excited.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's nice to see. You know, when people the passion and I saw the medal ceremony, and in years past, where countries expected to win more than a bronze or whatever it might have been, there were circumstances, particularly at the World Juniors, where some of the young guys got so angry they threw their medal into the crowd, and it just, and I get it, they're 18-year-olds, and to some degree you got to kind of cut them some slack. Wasn't happening with the Latvia team.
Yeah.
They were just beside themselves, excited to have won that hardware.
That's right. It was good. It was a good day to be there.
All right. So while you were away, they all of the toing and froing over the debt ceiling was going on, and as I described off the top, now we've got a deal. And I put that in quotations. There's a law that suspends the debt ceiling, I guess, until 2025. So effectively after the next presidential election, that would be the next time they'd have to really worry about it, right? Yeah. Okay. So give me a sense, because when we talked last week, Preet Banerjee, who was doing the analysis for us, he says, you may not realize this, but the United States is only one of two countries that has sort of self-imposed this debt ceiling, and it has become, as well-intended as it may have been to keep some guardrails around budgeting, has become this threat, this financial threat that not the Americans aren't the only ones that face. But if something happened untoward, and 8 years ago we said that would never happen in Washington. Well, that would never happen scenario's gone way out the window on so many levels. It could happen, and I don't know how close it came to happening, but it drives the real, I think, legitimate question and concern, given the political climate in Washington, that there were some who were prepared to go into default and not think twice about it. And that was going to splash on us. It was going to splash on Europe, Asia, everywhere. There seems to be a disregard for that.
Right. So let's talk a little bit about what the debt ceiling is first, just for clarification here. And the whole concept of a debt ceiling is unusual. Again, only the United States and Denmark have something that's like this. And what happens is that the U.S. puts together a budget every year, and unfortunately, for most of American history, we have spent more money than we've taken in, which means we have accumulated debts over time. We have to then basically borrow money to pay for our debts. What the debt ceiling is related to now what's called our national debt, how much money we totally owe based upon our borrowing over time. The debt ceiling is supposedly a statutory limit that says we can't borrow any more money beyond this certain amount. The whole concept of a debt ceiling didn't emerge in the United States until the 1930s as some tool, as you pointed out, to try to bring some fiscal discipline to the United States. And up until the 21st century, whenever we got to the debt ceiling limit, pro forma, just raised it, no big deal. But in an era of political polarization that we've seen for the last 20, 25 years, it's now become a tool. It's become a tool, a partisan tool in many cases, and I hate to say this, mostly by the Republicans, a tool used to try to extract concessions regarding spending or taxation, et cetera, et cetera. But what's important to understand is that through our regular appropriations process, Congress has already appropriated money, has already said, yes, we need to spend for good or for bad, and we know we're going to be borrowing money to do it. This is like a vote on top of that to say, here's the limit on how much we can actually borrow. And for many people, they say the whole idea of a debt ceiling makes no sense because we've already voted to spend the money. We of course have to pay. Now, the other point I want to make, and I think this is where you were going here, is why is this more of an issue, or why is this an issue that doesn't just affect the United States? Almost all international commerce is conducted with the dollar as its base currency. Whether it's oil, natural resources, most goods, everything is calculated that way. The dollar is still the international currency upon which many other currencies are based or traded. And part of the strength of the United States is being able to dominate the global economic market through its dollar. So if we default, this has a cascading effect across the world in terms of affecting the stock markets, in terms of investments, in terms of affecting just about everything. And that's the significance of what's going on.
So, in terms of the mechanism of it's understandable. But even when we looked at how it played out, it was used to effectively roll back some of those budget items, or the new legislation that had already been passed and approved. At what point does that initial discussion around whether it's healthcare services or social services or housing supports, whatever it might be, it almost becomes, okay, there's an asterisk beside everything of significance in terms of the legislation that Congress may pass, because when it comes down to the debt ceiling discussion, they can use that as leverage to roll things back or add new spending in.
You're absolutely right. There should be two discussions here. Discussion one is making the budget and what do we want to spend money for and how do we want to raise money. That should be the annual budget. Once that's done, the debt ceiling ought to be a completely separate issue that basically, if we're going to have a vote on it, is to say, yep, we've already agreed to spend this money. We're just going to reaffirm it, that we're going to pay our debts on it. What was being used here is using the debt ceiling as a way of revisiting past spending commitments or a way of trying to leverage down spending or change policy programs. And that's been the problem for the last few years, is confusing the annual appropriations process with the debt ceiling votes.
And when that happens, it sort of doesn't just jeopardize the U.S. economy, as we said. It puts some danger around the global economy. And there's more conversation now in the last couple of weeks about just eliminating the need for a debt ceiling in the United States. And it sounds as though that's split right down party lines. For the most part, the Democrats would be happy to get rid of it. A significant number of Republicans would want to hang on to it. Some might entertain the idea, but again, would want something for it. Is that likely?
Not likely, but it could happen. Okay, first, there's nothing constitutionally that requires that we have a debt ceiling. The whole idea of a debt ceiling is a product of American law in the 1930s that said we want to have these votes that place limits on our total debt or something like that. You could basically, think about what the deal that we just had. The deal just said we're going to suspend the debt ceiling for 2 years. Congress could have easily have said what? The deal could have been, we're going to permanently suspend the debt ceiling. There would have been nothing in violation of the Constitution that would prevent that. However, as is so many other problems in our American society and in our governing, you would have to get an agreement between the House and the Senate and the President to say permanently suspended. That's not going to happen. I can't see that in the near future, except in one scenario, and we'll talk about here. Conversely, there are some people who point to language in the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution that says that the credit of the United States shall not be questioned, and who argue and say that the debt ceiling limit might be unconstitutional. That's never been tested, and I can see a scenario where in the future it might be. So we saw Biden making some noise about a week ago saying, well, maybe I don't need Congress. Maybe I'll just say, I don't think the law is constitutional. I'll do it myself. We've had other people who have said, well, the way to address the debt ceiling would have been for the Department of Treasury to issue a $1 trillion US dollar coin and basically do it that way. All kinds of possibilities. Now, what's the one scenario where it could change? Let's imagine a scenario in 2024 where Biden wins, the Democrats hold the Senate, and the Democrats pick up the House of Representatives. So they've got the trifecta again. Congress could vote at that point to eliminate the debt ceiling. Now, many people are saying, but what about the filibuster? Well, because this is a fiscal matter, they could invoke what's called the budget reconciliation provision, which only requires a majority vote on budgetary tax issues. That would be the scenario in 2 years that could possibly happen. But there's a lot of ifs, as you noticed in my statement here.
Yeah, a lot of ifs. That's kind of what the whole playbook seems to be based on, and again, a lot of interpretation around that language, et cetera. Okay, so let's just put that aside, and you talk about some of these other issues. I noted the piece that you wrote for The Hill recently, talking about the Supreme Court perhaps reinstituting the possibility or giving more leeway for jurisdictions to have mandatory prayer in schools. Here in this part of the world, we have 4 separate school boards in Ontario, 2 French, 2 English, 2 public, and 2 Catholic boards. And that you can imagine over the number of years how this conversation has gone back and forth. And most recently, the question around the Catholic boards has come to light again, because one of the Catholic boards refused to fly the pride flag in June. So this reignited this entire debate as to whether or not we should have, the religious affiliation for the school board at all. Having said that, prayer in those schools is a go-ahead. It's understood, and we move forward. In the United States, for a long time, it has been such that you can't force somebody to have prayer in school. That seems to, based on what you were writing in The Hill, that tide seems to be turning fairly significantly and swiftly, no?
It is correct. In the early 1960s, the U.S. Supreme Court aggressively moved to say that because of the Establishment Clause, Congress shall pass no law establishing, religion. Basically said that mandatory prayer in public schools violated the Constitution. And that was a pretty important, set of decisions. And the court pretty much, up until about a few years ago, hung firm on that. The idea of saying that the Establishment Clause created this high wall of separation. But what we've seen increasingly under the Roberts Court is not a privileging or prioritizing of the Establishment Clause, but the Free Exercise Clause, and saying that teachers, football coaches, perhaps other individuals have free religious expression rights, free exercise rights, and that we need to respect those. And so what we're seeing is a shift, an interesting shift of the court away from establishment to free exercise, away from saying that the public needs to be insulated from forced government of religion, to now the emphasis being placed upon individuals should be able to express their religious views, even in public settings. And I think we're at a point very close where some of those old precedents are going to start to get chipped away, where the court is going to eventually say it's a violation of the Free Exercise Clause of the Constitution not to let people pray in school, not to let teachers lead prayer, not to let school districts do this. That's a pretty big shift. And the irony, I think, is also at a time when we're getting to about a majority of the American public that now considers itself to be non-Christian or non-religious. So it's a pretty dramatic set of shifts going on, where the court's becoming more I call it sectarian, at a time that American society is becoming more secular.
Mm. And, in this country, we would look at it and see in Canada, where we, particularly in Toronto, for example, the diversity of our city and the population across the province, quite frankly, in Ontario, is probably more diverse than it is, generally speaking, in the United States. So without saying so, if the court were to give its blessing and I use that word advisedly, to the idea that there could be prayer in the classroom. Overwhelmingly, that prayer is most likely to be Christian prayer.
Correct. Yeah, there's no question about it, is that even though we're at a tipping point, still Christianity is the dominant religion in the United States. And the people who are pushing this the hardest are Christian groups. I also point out kind of the irony is that the majority that is pushing it on the Supreme Court are a majority that identify as Roman Catholic.
Mm. Yeah, well, and I guess even at that stage, there's a demographic, even the age breakdown there, though, as well, in terms of you talk about, who identifies with whatever religion.
Sure.
I would say increasingly it's the baby boomers that might, and everybody younger than the baby boomers is declining in terms of supporting that. So I wonder where the court begins to lie on how this reflects the United States and its population and its needs. And, I realize the courts shouldn't be playing with polls or, deep research. But at what point does that have to reflect that cultural norm?
See, I think at some point, the court, even though it's supposed to protect minority rights, and that's important to do so against the majority, at some point the court still has to reflect on one level majoritarian preferences. And what I mean by that is that for the court to be viewed as legitimate, in some way, shape, or form, its decisions have to reflect what I'm going to call the considered moral judgments of what society thinks is right and wrong. At some point, it's got moral authority. And if you're getting to a point now where it is out of sync where the public is on really critical issues, whether it is on school prayer or LGBTQ issues or reproductive rights. And there's increasing evidence that this court in the United States is dramatically out of sync with the public on all those issues. It creates real legitimacy problems for the judiciary. And so longer term, it's really creating problems for itself. And of course, longer term, if the courts are not trusted and public opinion polls are now suggesting that, this creates real problems for a democracy.
Mm. Just before we go, speaking of democracy, we're getting more names and hats thrown into the ring as far as GOP nominees. I think Chris Christie is expected this week. Nikki Haley was on CNN last night. Mike Pence expected I think he's got a town hall again later this week on CNN. You and I have not talked since the disastrous CNN town hall with Donald Trump. I know the folks at home can't see it, but you're rolling your eyes.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the idea that this is getting to be a larger field, and I heard some interesting analysis yesterday that Chris Christie might be getting into this not necessarily to win, but to be the anti-Trump, to actually call him out at every turn, understanding that right now there aren't a lot of other candidates who are willing to do that. And for the sake of the GOP, somebody has to take on Trump.
And I think that's likely him being that person. He's a former prosecutor. He's very well versed in terms of debating. He's very aggressive. And even though he's kind of had a love-hate relationship with Trump, remember he was his head of his transition team back in 2016, 2017. I think you're right. I think he's going to go in as the person who thinks he's going to take down Trump. And I say thinks because we don't know if it's going to happen yet. But this is kind of like watching, I don't know, the WWF on Saturday night or something like that. It's going to be two heavyweights slugging it out at this point. Because you're right. DeSantis wants to criticize Trump, but if he criticizes too harshly, he may lose the Trump voters that he wants. Because he basically wants to say, I'm Trump without the baggage. Hard to make that argument and then criticize Trump at the same time. So this is going to be interesting. But on the other hand, this is a scenario of how Trump got the nomination back in 2016. It was what was it, like about 20 people who were running for Republican for president, and he just did a divide and conquer. So we're going to see at this point if all these people repeat 2016 or, as you pointed out here, is Christie and maybe DeSantis able to, if I can use the fight metaphor, land a couple of lethal blows.
Yeah, and I think you would hope, and I say this in terms of just an objective view, that anytime this kind of scenario was unfolding, and to recreate that scenario would clearly lead to what you saw in the past. I would think that the strategists who are involved here are thinking, here's what we learned, because quite frankly, 17, 18, 20 people on the stage with Trump in 2016 going in, nobody thought he could win. Going in now, they're the one they're afraid is going to win. So I would think that their posture and definitely they've got their guard up a little bit better than they had than they did in 2016. It might be a far more strategic and maybe, to your point, more of a nasty hammer and tong kind of fight for the Republicans. But given that, and you use the wrestling analogy, it's as much about entertainment as it is about winning. The other criticisms I heard from Democrats over the weekend as all this was unfolding is that the Republicans, like it or not, have got this sideshow, get your popcorn feel going to the whole thing. There's an energy around it. Again, doesn't matter whether you like it or not, but they're taking up all of the oxygen around the conversation. And there's nothing going on the Democrat side now that Joe Biden has said he's running for another term, and not likely to happen, because anytime that if the Democrats step out and challenge Biden, they're only going to sort of hurt their own cause. So all of that activity on the Republican side, boy, I'm telling you, as I watched it and kind of considered the balance, getting bipartisanship deals done in the White House and all that kind of stuff might sound great, but it really is a low-grade buzz compared to the excitement that, and I use that word in air quotes, that the Republicans are going to generate may bode poorly for the Democrats.
Yeah, I think the success of Biden in 2020 was the fact that he was the anti-Trump. He was, hate to phrase it, he was the boring, anti-dramatic Trump, and America wanted that. Well, it may be now 4 years later that Americans don't want boring Joe, and for all kinds of reasons. And you're right, there's no excitement there, there's no drama there, and therefore the media, the mainstream media, is not going to focus much on Biden. And it's probably a different show for a different day to point out the fact that in many ways Biden's list of accomplishments as president is actually quite impressive. He really, ranging anywhere from environment to this. I think the deal that we just got in terms of the debt ceiling was important, infrastructure bills, and also an issue that people don't pay much attention to. He's put an enormous number of judges on the federal bench. And so there's a lot of accomplishments, but they're not exciting. And Biden is not an exciting person. And that may be why he got elected. That could be potentially why he doesn't win re-election. We don't know.
We had a few years ago, we had Rob Ford was our mayor here in Toronto, and was a rather, needless to say, a colorful guy. And the mayor who followed him was John Tory. He was the former leader of the Progressive Conservative Party here in Ontario. And one analyst described John this way: he was the sorbet mayor that Toronto needed. Biden may well be the sorbet president that America needed, just to cleanse the palate and move on.
That may be the description of the day. Most of us thought he was the transitional president. I never thought he would be running for a second term.
Yeah,
but he is. And the implications for that, in terms of if you were not to run, it's also the question of who do the Democrats actually have and who can they coalesce around? They really don't have anybody else besides Joe Biden.
Mm-hmm. David Schultz, good of you to join us. And we will we'll catch up on some of those sub stories. I do want to get into the McCarthy drama. He's waving the flag saying he won, but is he at jeopardy as this thing moves forward? As the Freedom Caucus kind of start sharpening their knives? I'm not sure it's going to happen in the next week, but it sure sounds like he might have to be head on a swivel there, watching who's coming at him in the days to come. Thanks for joining us. It's always good to talk to you.
My pleasure. Talk to you soon, and go hockey. See you later. Bye.
Go hockey.
Pay no attention to that man behind the curtain.
Now and Next is produced by Becky Coles. Our production manager is Jamie Nickerson. Audio editors are Mike Trutler and Drew Garner. And our sonic logo designer is Greg McDonald. Our executive producers are Dave and Aaron Trafford.
This is SSN.
Story Studio Network.